The wooden auction stage stood under the golden sun, surrounded by a restless crowd. People whispered, some pointing at the large metal cage in the center. Inside, a bear sat motionless, its dark eyes staring at the ground. His fur was rough, patches missing, scars running across his body. He had been through things no one here could imagine. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Next, we have a wild bear, caught from the northern forests. Strong but stubborn, not the friendliest one, but with the right training, who knows? He laughed, hitting his wooden hammer against the podium. Let's start the bidding at 500. Silence. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Someone in the back scoffed. Who would want a broken bear? Another murmured. Looks useless, probably aggressive. A man in a suit shook his head. Not worth it. The bear didn't react. He had heard voices like this before, seen eyes filled with rejection, disgust, fear. The auctioneer sighed. No one? All right, let's move to 1,000, a voice called out. Heads turned. A young man stood at the back, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. He didn't look rich, didn't look like someone who belonged in a place like this, but his voice was steady, his eyes locked onto the bear. The auctioneer blinked. Sir, you understand this isn't a trained bear. It might be dangerous. I know. Murmurs spread through the crowd. The young man didn't flinch. He stepped forward, pulling out a small stack of worn bills. 1,000. Final offer. The hammer came down. Sold, people muttered as the young man walked up to the cage. The bear finally looked up, their eyes meeting. For the first time in a long while, the bear felt something strange. Curiosity. The iron cage rattled as the handlers struggled to move the bear into the truck. Thick chains were wrapped around his neck and paws, forcing him forward. He didn't resist. He had learned long ago that fighting back only made things worse. The young man, now closer, observed everything silently. His face showed no fear, no hesitation, just focus. One of the handlers smirked at him. You sure about this, kid? This bear's got nothing left in him. Won't fetch you a penny. The young man's expression didn't change. I didn't buy him to sell him. The handler raised an eyebrow but shrugged. Your problem now. With a final shove, the bear was secured in the back of the truck. The cage door slammed shut. The drive back was quiet, except for the occasional rattling of chains. The bear sat motionless, staring at the road through the gaps in the metal. He didn't know where he was being taken. Didn't care. Wherever it was, it wouldn't be any different from the last place. The truck finally stopped. The young man hopped out and moved to the back. He unlatched the cage and pulled the chains loose. Come on, he said, stepping back. The bear didn't move. The young man waited a few seconds before sighing. He turned away, leaving the cage open. Your choice. He walked toward a small wooden cabin in the middle of a vast open land. No fences, no cages, just endless trees stretching toward the mountains. The air smelled different here, fresh, untouched. The wind carried the sounds of rustling leaves and distant streams. The bear remained inside the cage, staring at the open door. The world outside looked too wide, unfamiliar. He had spent years behind bars, surrounded by walls. The open space felt unnatural. Minutes passed, then an hour. The young man came back outside, sat on the porch and sipped from a tin cup. He didn't look at the bear, didn't call him, just waited. The sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Crickets began to hum. A soft breeze whispered through the trees. The bear took a step forward, then another. The cold ground pressed against his paws. It felt strange, almost unfamiliar. He took a few more hesitant steps until he was completely out of the cage. The young man didn't react. He just kept drinking from his cup. But a small, almost invisible smile played on his lips. The bear turned his head slightly, sniffing the air. The scent of the wild was here. Earth, wood, water. It stirred something deep inside him, something he had forgotten. Freedom. But he didn't trust it. Not yet. He settled down a few feet from the porch, his heavy body lowering to the ground. He wouldn't go far. Not tonight. The young man got up, stretched, and stepped inside the cabin. He left the door open, not as an invitation, just open. The bear watched him disappear inside, listened to the quiet crackling of a fire. The warmth of it carried into the cool night air. He closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he slept without chains. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. A soft mist lingered over the open land, curling around the trees like a ghost fading into the daylight. The bear stirred, his heavy eyelids fluttering. Open. For a moment he was confused. The cold ground beneath him, the wide sky above. It was all wrong. There were no iron bars, no dark, suffocating walls, no distant echoes of metal chains dragging across concrete. Then he remembered. He lifted his head slightly, glancing toward the wooden cabin. The door was shut now, but thin trails of smoke curled from the chimney. Inside, he could hear soft movement, the sound of footsteps against wooden floors, the clinking of metal. The young man. The bear exhaled heavily, lowering his head again. He didn't trust the human, didn't trust this place, but he didn't move either. Minutes passed, then the door creaked open. The young man stepped onto the porch, a metal plate in his hands. The scent of something warm drifted into the air. Cooked fish. The bear's nose twitched instinctively. The young man sat on the steps, his posture relaxed. He placed the plate on the wooden floor beside him and leaned back, stretching his legs. Hungry? His voice was calm, casual, as if speaking to an old friend. The bear didn't move. The young man shrugged and picked up a piece of fish for himself, taking a slow bite. He chewed thoughtfully, staring at the horizon. "I don't know what they called you before," he said after a while, "but I guess that doesn't matter now." Silence. The wind whistled through the trees, carrying the scent of the fish closer to the bear. His stomach tightened. It had been a while since he had real food, actual food, not the scraps and rotten meat they used to throw at him. But he didn't move. The young man kept eating, unbothered. "I had a dog once," he said suddenly, "when I was a kid. Found him by the river. He was scared of people, too." He chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "Took me weeks to get him to come near me. Thought he'd never trust me. But one day he just did." The bear listened, though he didn't understand the words. But something about the young man's voice. It wasn't like the others. It didn't have that sharp edge, the one that always came before pain. The fish sat untouched on the wooden porch. Minutes passed. The young man didn't move it closer, didn't force it on him. He just sat there, waiting. The bear eyed the food again. His stomach twisted. He swallowed hard, his instincts screaming at him to stay still, to wait, to not fall for the trap. But the hunger gnawed at him like an open wound. Slowly, cautiously, he pushed himself up. His massive paws pressed against the earth as he took a careful step forward, then another. The wooden porch creaked under his weight as he drew closer. The young man didn't move. The bear lowered his head, sniffing the plate. The fish smelled fresh. No stench of rot or poison. He hesitated only a second longer before his tongue flicked out, grabbing a small piece. Warm, software real. He ate another bite, then another. The young man smiled slightly but said nothing. He just leaned back against the wooden post, watching as the bear finished the food in silence. The plate was empty within minutes. The bear licked his lips, his dark eyes flickering toward the young man. He expected something now, a chain, a cage, a price. But the young man only stood up, stretching. "Guess you were hungry after all," he muttered, gathering the empty plate. I'll make more later." Then he turned and walked inside, leaving the door open just a crack. The bear watched him go, his chest rising and falling steadily. He looked at the door, then at the trees. He could leave, right now, walk into the forest, disappear, never look back. But his paws remained still. He lowered himself back down, resting his head on the cool wooden steps. For some reason, he wasn't ready to go just yet. The days passed in quiet understanding. The bear stayed near the cabin, though he never stepped inside. The young man never forced him. He simply let him be. Every morning the young man left the porch door open and placed food outside. Sometimes it was fish, sometimes small pieces of meat. The bear never ate immediately. He waited, watched, listened. When he was sure there were no tricks, he would step forward and eat, his sharp teeth tearing through the meal in silence. At night, he slept near the cabin, his massive body curled under the stars. The open land still made him uneasy, but the presence of the cabin, of the young man's steady movements inside, made him feel something. Not safe. Not yet. But less afraid. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, the young man sat on the steps with a book in his hands. He wasn't reading, just flipping through the pages lazily. "You ever seen the mountains up close?" he asked suddenly. His voice was calm, casual, as always. The bear, lying a few feet away, lifted his head slightly. The young man pointed toward the distance. "There's a valley behind those peaks. Real quiet. No hunters, no people, just endless trees and rivers." He paused. "A bear would like it there." The bear blinked, watching him. He didn't understand the words, but he caught something in the young man's tone. The young man exhaled, shutting the book with a soft thud. "Tomorrow, I'll take a trip up there." He stretched his arms over his head. "You can come if you want, or don't. Your choice." The bear lowered his head again, closing his eyes. He wasn't sure what to make of this human. He wasn't like the others. He didn't shout or threaten, didn't try to control him, didn't even try to touch him. And yet there was something about the way he spoke, like he wasn't expecting anything from him. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance an owl hooted. The bear listened to the sound, letting it mix with the crackling of the fire inside the cabin. He would decide tomorrow. The next morning, the young man packed a small bag and slung it over his shoulder. He didn't say anything as he stepped off the porch and started walking toward the trees. The bear watched him go. He could ignore it. Stay here. Eat the food the young man left for him, sleep under the cabin's shadow, and live in this strange new silence. But something inside him stirred. Before he could think too much about it, he pushed himself up and followed. The young man didn't turn around, didn't look back to check. He just kept walking, as if he knew. The forest swallowed them in thick greenery. The bear moved with instinct, his large paws silent against the earth. The trees whispered as the wind passed through them, the scent of water growing stronger. Birds flitted through the branches, their wings catching glimmers of the morning light. The bear had forgotten how this felt, not walking in a cage, not moving in circles around cold metal bars, but truly walking, moving without restraint. They climbed higher into the mountains, the air growing thinner. The young man didn't struggle, his steps sure and steady. Occasionally he'd glance back, but not with fear, just curiosity. Hours passed before they reached a clearing. A vast valley stretched before them, untouched and wild. Rivers carved silver lines through the earth, glistening under the sun. The sky stretched endlessly above. The bear stopped. His chest rose and fell steadily, his dark eyes scanning the open space. This was freedom. This was the world before cages. The young man exhaled, taking in the view. "I told you it was quiet up here." The bear didn't move. He just stood there, letting the wind weave through his fur, letting the mountain air fill his lungs. Then, for the first time since he had arrived, he took a step forward on his own, not because he was forced, not because he had no choice, but because he wanted to. The young man smiled slightly and sat on a rock, giving him space. The bear walked further, his massive paws sinking into the untouched earth. The world stretched before him, open and waiting. For the first time in his life, he wasn't being led. He was choosing. The wind carried the scent of damp soil and fresh pine, wrapping around the bear like an old memory. He took another step forward, his claws sinking into the cool earth. The valley stretched endlessly before him, rolling hills, winding rivers, and trees taller than anything he had ever seen. The sky felt bigger here, endless and open. He had never been somewhere like this. The young man sat on a flat rock a few feet away, tossing a small stone between his fingers. He didn't say anything, didn't push the bear to move further or turn back. He simply watched, as if waiting for the bear to decide what came next. The bear lowered his head, sniffing the ground. It smelled untouched, pure, nothing like the metal floors of his cage or the sweat and blood of the auction house. His ears twitched at the distant sound of rushing water. A river. The instinct in him stirred. Slowly he moved toward the sound, his heavy paws silent on the damp grass. The young man stood, slinging his bag over his shoulder, and followed at a distance. The river was clearer than anything the bear had ever seen, its surface glistening under the midday sun. Fish flickered beneath the water, their silver scales catching the light. The bear hesitated at the edge, his reflection staring back at him. A face marked by scars, a body hardened by suffering. A stranger. The young man crouched a few feet away, cupping water in his hands and drinking. "It's clean," he muttered, wiping his mouth with his sleeve. "Untouched." The bear's nose twitched, his thirst gnawed at him, but hesitation kept him still. He had learned the hard way that water wasn't always safe. The young man seemed to understand. He leaned back against a tree, giving the bear space. Minutes passed. Finally, the bear stepped forward, lowering his massive head. He lapped at the water cautiously. The cool liquid rushed down his throat, clean and fresh, unlike anything he had tasted before. The young man smirked, told, "You." The bear ignored him and kept drinking. For a while they stayed by the river. The young man sat on a rock, tossing pebbles into the water. The bear settled on the riverbank, listening to the quiet hum of the wild, the rustling leaves, the distant chirping of birds, the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. Then the young man spoke. "I know you don't trust me." His voice was calm, steady, like it always was. "I don't blame you." The bear flicked an ear but didn't lift his head. The young man continued, his gaze fixed on the water. "People hurt you, locked you up, used you." He paused, exhaling through his nose. "I get it." Silence stretched between them. The bear didn't move. "I used to be caged, too," the young man muttered, almost as if speaking to himself. "Not like you, not with metal bars, but still trapped." His fingers tightened around a small rock before he tossed it into the river. "I know what it's like to want to run, but not know where to go." The bear watched him now, not fully understanding but sensing something in his voice. A weight, a truth. The young man sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's why I brought you here," he said finally. "Not to keep you, not to own you, just to give you a choice." The words settled in the air between them. The bear turned his head, looking back toward the valley. The mountains rose in the distance, untouched and waiting. If he left now, no one would stop him. No chains, no cages, just freedom. But then he glanced at the young man, at the calm way he sat, the way he never forced, never demanded. The way he left the door open, the way he never reached for the chains that once held him. The bear had never known a human like this. For the first time he realized this human wasn't caging him, he was setting him free. A slow breeze rolled through the valley, rustling the trees, carrying the scent of the wild. The bear inhaled deeply. He had a choice now. And for the first time in his life he wasn't afraid to make it. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the valley. The bear stood motionless, his dark eyes scanning the endless stretch of wilderness ahead. His entire life had been spent behind bars, under the control of cruel hands that dictated every moment of his existence. Now, for the first time, he stood at the edge of something vast and unknown, completely free. But what did freedom even mean? The young man sat on a nearby rock, absent-mindedly tossing pebbles into the river. He didn't push, didn't speak. He simply existed in the same space, waiting. The bear took a slow step forward, his heavy paws pressing into the damp earth. The scent of fresh pine and river water filled his lungs, stirring something deep inside him. He had always known fear, he had always known pain. But this was different. He turned his head slightly, looking at the young man. The human had never forced him to do anything, never used a chain, never raised his voice, never even tried to touch him. He had simply been there, offering food, offering silence, offering something the bear couldn't quite understand. For days, the bear had expected a trap, expected this human to be like all the others, but nothing had happened. No cage had snapped shut, no whip had cracked, just open doors, open spaces, open choices. The young man exhaled and leaned back on his hands. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" His voice was as steady as ever. "Leaving." The bear flicked his ear. The young man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You don't owe me anything, you know." His gaze drifted to the horizon. "I brought you here because I figured, if I was you, I'd want the chance to decide for myself." The bear shifted his weight, his claws scraping against the dirt. He had never been given a choice before. He didn't know how to make one. He turned back toward the valley. He could run, walk into the forest and never look back. He would never see another human again. But then he thought about the cabin, the soft crackling of the fire, the food left on the porch, the quiet patience of the man who never tried to tame him. The world had never been kind to the bear. But this human, he was different. The young man sighed, rubbing his neck. "Well," he muttered, standing up, "whatever you decide, I'm heading back before dark." He stretched his arms over his head and slung his bag over his shoulder. Then, without another word, he turned and began walking down the mountain path. The bear watched him go. This was it, the moment. He could turn the other way, disappear into the trees, claim the wild as his own. Or... The young man didn't look back. He just kept walking, as if he had already made peace with whatever choice the bear would make. The bear hesitated. Then, without fully understanding why, he took a step, then another, and another. His massive paws pressed into the earth, following the same path the young man had taken. He moved slowly, cautiously, but he moved. The young man didn't stop, didn't acknowledge him. He just kept walking as though he had expected this all along. They walked in silence, side by side, until the trees swallowed them again. The valley faded behind them, but the weight of it remained in the bear's chest. Maybe one day he would leave. Maybe one day he would wander into the mountains and never return. But not today. Today he chose to stay. As they walked back through the dense forest, the sky darkened into deep shades of blue, stars flickering to life above. The bear moved with quiet certainty, his massive paws treading a path that was no longer unfamiliar. He wasn't being led, he wasn't being forced. He was walking beside someone, something he had never done before. The cabin came into view, its windows glowing with the soft light of a fire inside. The young man stepped onto the porch, pausing only for a moment before pushing the door open. He walked in, leaving the door slightly ajar, just as he always did. The bear stood at the edge of the porch, looking at the open doorway. He could turn away, return to the wilderness, vanish into the trees, and never look back. But instead he stepped forward, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And as the night wrapped around the cabin, for the first time in his life, the bear didn't feel like he was caged. He felt like he had found a place where he belonged. Moral of the story: true freedom isn't just about escaping captivity. It's about having the choice to stay where you feel safe, valued, and respected. Trust takes time to rebuild, and sometimes kindness is the only bridge between fear and healing. The strongest bonds aren't forced, they are chosen.